The Kalam Cosmological Argument is a philosophical proof that is frequently used by theists to prove the existence of God. If you're familiar with this argument, then you already know that the most famous proponent of this argument is William Lane Craig, a Christian theologian and philosopher. He's so closely associated with this argument that when you look up the Wikipedia page for this topic, it has a picture of Craig at the very top. Now, there's a good reason why this argument is so popular among theists. The premises of this argument are based on some very simple and intuitive notions, so it makes quite a compelling case for the existence of God. But I'm going to break it down to show precisely where it falls short. Now, there are a ton of video essays arguing and counter-arguing this proof, but I wouldn't be making this video if I was simply rehashing all these other arguments. What I've noticed is the vast majority of the objections to this argument focus on these two things. One, whether the universe actually has a beginning. These arguments bring up the various definitions and types of infinities to argue that an actual infinitely existing universe is not a problem. And two, whether random fluctuations of space-time can bring the universe into existence without requiring an explicit cause. I mentioned this to make it clear that these are not going to be the lines of attack that I'll be taking here. Trust me, I'm not going to bring up anything to do with quantum mechanics in this video. I'll just be sticking to basic, non-technical, completely intuitive concepts here. I think these objections, regardless of whether or not they're valid, miss a far more fundamental flaw in the Kalam argument, which I hope to make clear to you by the end of this video. Now, to ensure that I'm not misrepresenting the argument, I will be referring to the formal version of the argument as expressed by William Lane Craig in Chapter 3 of the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, which was published in 2009. I'll also be referring to Craig's article, God and the Beginning of Time, which was published on his website, reasonablefaith.org, for further clarifications. Okay, so let's start off with the Kalam argument itself to see what it says. Here is the argument in syllogistic form. Premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Alright, now let's try to understand what this argument is saying, because it seems obviously true at first glance. It's basically saying that things don't just pop into existence. If something comes into existence, there must have been a cause for it. And given that the universe cannot be infinitely old, it too must have come into existence some finite time in the past, which means there must have been a cause for it. Now, obviously, the cause of the universe cannot be its own self. It must be something else. So it must be some other entity that is immaterial and powerful enough to create the entire universe. Clearly, God is such a being, so the conclusion is essentially saying that the universe has a cause, and this cause is God. Okay, so that all makes sense. Doesn't seem like there's anything controversial there. So why am I saying that this argument is invalid? Now, getting ahead of myself, I'll just let you know that the brunt of my attack will be against premise number 1, which is the premise that says that everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Now, I'm not going to deny the principle of cause and effect here. I completely agree with that principle. Nor am I going to argue that just because quantum virtual particles pop in and out of existence seemingly without a cause, it invalidates this premise. But what I am going to do here is that I'll show you how the precise definition of the term begins to exist that Craig has used for this proof is entirely different from what you probably understand by that term. And it's this specific bait and switch which makes the first premise impossible to justify. I'll also show that it's not a coincidence that Craig uses this particular bizarre definition of something beginning to exist. I'll show you why he was forced to do so in order to make his argument work. By the way, just keep in mind that this first premise is the one which Craig justifies by arguing that it is so intuitively obvious that it doesn't even need a justification. He says we take one to be obviously true, at least more plausibly true than its negation. He gives several examples of how things that come into existence obviously must have causes for them, like horses or tigers or villages. Now, I'll get back to this point a bit later in the video, but just keep these examples in mind for now, because the choice of these particular examples is very telling. Alright, so let's start off with some basic examples for what it means for something to begin to exist or come into being, as Craig also phrases it in his essay. So, for example, if we draw a timeline for when a particular car comes into existence, it looks like this. In the beginning, there are only raw materials for the car. the metal, plastic, rubber, etc. But the car itself does not exist at this time. These raw materials are then processed in a factory, and then at some point further down the timeline, we have the fully manufactured car. So this car came into existence sometime after the factory started processing its raw materials. We might quibble about which moment precisely this happens, but no one can deny that when there were only raw materials, the car did not exist. And then later, when the car was fully manufactured, it did exist. So clearly this car came into existence. Okay, now let's try one more example. Let's try something natural like an apple. So initially, there are only flowers in apple trees, which then get pollinated, and then several months later, they turn into apples. And just like with cars, we can argue about the exact moment it happens, but clearly sometime in between the flower getting pollinated and the apple becoming fully ripe, the apple has come into existence. Okay, so far so good. But let's try this with something a bit more complex. Can we say the same thing about time itself? As in, can we say that time also came into existence sometime in the past? In fact, is it even possible for time to come into existence? So some of you probably already see the problem right away. For something like a car or an apple to come into existence, there has to be a moment in time where it doesn't exist. And then there's a later moment in time where it does, because coming into existence is a change in state of a thing over time. And that's why we cannot say the same thing about time itself. There was never a time where time did not exist. So time cannot come into existence, because for that to happen, there must be a time where time doesn't exist. And obviously that's a contradiction. So to answer my earlier question, no, time cannot possibly come into existence, at least insofar as what we typically understand by the term come into existence. Okay, so this then produces a dilemma for a theist trying to prove that the universe must have come into existence, because time is a part of the universe. So if time cannot come into existence, then you cannot say that the universe came into existence, since time is part of the universe. So this fact invalidates the entire claim about the universe coming into existence. So now this is where the theist needs to get a little tricky and change the definition of something coming into existence to mean something entirely new, so that they can still say that the universe came into existence, but mean something completely different by it. And that's exactly what Craig has done in his essay in the Blackwell Companion. Let me show the definition here in its entirety so you can see it for yourself. Okay, so it's a two-part definition. Let me read it out. The first part says, X begins to exist at time t if and only if, oh, by the way, X is just any random object, and that if with two F's in it is not a typo. It just means if and only if. So anytime you see an if with two F's, just read it as if and only if. Okay, so X begins to exist at time t if and only if X comes into being at time t. And then the second part says, X comes into being at t if and only if X exists at t and the actual world includes no state of affairs in which X exists timelessly. 2. T is either the first time at which X exists or is separated from any t prime less than t at which X existed by an interval during which X does not exist. And 3. X's existing at t is a tensed fact. Now, before I spend some time explaining this definition, just take a moment to go over it again. Tell me, is this even remotely a clear or intuitive definition of something beginning to exist? In all your life, have you ever understood something beginning to exist to mean this? Have you ever thought that a car beginning to exist involved the actual world having no state of affairs where the car existed timelessly? What does existing timelessly even mean? Clearly, this is the most convoluted and unintuitive definition of something beginning to exist you've ever seen. Okay, now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that just because it's unintuitive means that it is incorrect or illogical. The only reason I'm showing how completely unintuitive this definition is because Craig argues that the first premise is, quote, obviously true, unquote. Not just true, obviously true. Now, regardless of whether or not you feel this definition is valid, I hope you can at least see why the claim that this premise is obviously true is completely absurd given how convoluted this definition of the phrase begin to exist is. Now, Craig does give 3 reasons for why he thinks this premise is true, and I will go over them one by one to explain why they're not valid. But first, I need to explain this definition of begin to exist so you can understand his argument more clearly. So, part A is saying X begins to exist at time t if and only if X comes into being at t. In other words, he's saying that the phrase begins to exist means the same thing as comes into being. Maybe he should have just used the phrase comes into being from the start then, instead of going with begins to exist and then replacing it with comes into being later when defining it. But that's not relevant to my objection to his proof, so I'm going to move on. Alright, part B of the definition has 3 conditions that need to be met. The first condition is X comes into being at t if and only if X exists at t and the actual world includes no state of affairs in which X exists timelessly. Now, what does this mean? Well, the first part of this condition, the part before the comma, is obvious. Because for something to come into being at time t, it has to exist at that time. If it doesn't exist at that time, then it cannot have come into being yet. So basically, this part is just saying that if something comes into being, then it exists. So far so good, nothing controversial yet. But the second part, the part after the comma, is where the trickery is introduced. This part says that the actual world cannot include a state of affairs where the thing that begins to exist exists timelessly. Now think about this for a moment. Do you get what this means? What does existing timelessly mean? And what on earth does it have to do with whether or not it begins to exist? Now, Craig doesn't define anywhere what it means for something to exist timelessly, so we just have to make some educated guesses based on his usage of the term and some examples he's given. He says, for there appear to be only 2 candidates which can be described as immaterial, beginningless, uncaused, timeless, and spaceless beings, either abstract objects or an unembodied mind. Abstract objects such as numbers, sets, propositions, properties are very typically construed by philosophers who include such things in their ontology as being precisely the sort of entities which begin to exist necessarily, timelessly, and spacelessly. Similarly, philosophers who hold the possibilities of disembodied mind would describe such mental substances as immaterial and spaceless, and there seems no reason to think that a cosmic mind might not also be beginningless and uncaused, end quote. Okay, so we have 2 examples here, abstract objects and unembodied minds. Abstract objects are things like mathematical equations, like say the equation 2 + 2 = 4. Unembodied minds are minds that supposedly exist without bodies, that is pure non-physical minds. Now, obviously we have no existence of such non-physical minds, and that's not something Craig is using to prove his argument either, so we don't have to dive deeper into this concept. But we do know what mathematical equations are, so let's talk about this part. So my question to you is, do mathematical equations exist outside of our minds? If no humans nor any other intelligent species ever existed, would those mathematical equations still exist? What does it mean for a mathematical equation to exist when there is no one to think it? Of course, even if we don't exist, 2 oranges and 2 more oranges will give a total of 4 oranges. But that's just the oranges existing. That's not the equation which exists in the external world. Do math equations exist in the external world, or only physical objects that they represent? Those oranges certainly aren't timeless, right? And they're the things that actually exist. The equation that we think of to quantify the number of oranges is just in our minds. We can apply the same equation to any object, not just oranges. We can use it to quantify apples, cars, trees, and so on. And that's because this equation is just our way of thinking about the world. It doesn't actually exist in the world. Now remember, I'm not saying that the mathematical equation is false if people don't exist. I'm just saying that the equation doesn't exist if there's no one who thinks of it. The very fact that we refer to these equations as abstract objects shows that they're not like regular physical objects, since abstract objects exist only in our thoughts, not in the external world. That's what abstraction means. Now, regardless of whether or not you think these abstract objects actually exist, the point remains that Craig explains what he means by existing timelessly using only two examples that he says satisfies this property: unembodied minds and abstract objects, both of which we have no evidence of existence for. So what's going on here? Why does Craig require that it should not be possible for X to exist timelessly in order for it to begin existing? Why introduce such a bizarre requirement that makes the argument so much harder to prove? Can't it be proven without injecting the idea of timeless entities into his proof? Well, the answer is no, he can't. And he can't because he needs to excuse God from his own rule about things beginning to exist. That is, given how he's phrased his argument, it's very clear that unless he throws in that extra condition about timelessness, his argument applies equally to God as well. And that would mean that his own argument proves that God himself has a beginning too. And he obviously cannot allow that since it defeats the entire purpose of his argument. So he had to inject the requirement about timelessness into his proof. Let me break this down to you so you can see what I mean. Remember earlier in this video where I explained how it's impossible for time to come into existence? Well, Craig recognizes this impossibility, so he doesn't say that time came into existence in the same sense that cars and apples come into existence. He argues that God's creation of time was not temporally prior to time's existence, but it was causally prior. To quote Craig, he says, God exists timelessly sans creation, and temporally at and subsequent to the moment of creation, so that his act of causing the beginning of the universe is simultaneous with the universe's beginning to exist. And also, in an analogous way, we could say that God's timeless eternity is, as it were, a boundary of time which is causally, but not temporally, prior to the origin of the universe. In both sections, he's saying that God's creation of the universe wasn't the result of an event that occurred before the universe existed. It happened simultaneously, that is, at the same time with the first moment that the universe existed. Saying that God existed prior to the existence of the universe implies that there was time prior to the existence of the universe. But that's not possible, since you cannot have a prior moment when time itself doesn't exist. In fact, Craig himself states that the first moment that God exists is also the first moment that the universe exists. He says, the time of the first event would be not only the first time at which the universe exists, but also technically the first time at which God exists, since sans the universe, God exists timelessly. So, Craig is forced to draw the timeline of creation the following way. That is, the universe started existing at the same time as God did, because you cannot go further left on the timeline before the creation of the universe, because time doesn't even exist there. An analogy here that makes this easier to understand is the latitude of the North Pole. If I ask you what is 10 meters north of the North Pole, what would you say? You would probably say that this question makes no sense since there's nothing to the north of the North Pole. The North Pole is where north starts. So the question of what lies 10 meters north of the North Pole makes no sense. Similarly, asking what happened before the creation of the universe is nonsensical since time is part of the universe. And the question of what happened before the creation of time is nonsensical since there is no before when time doesn't exist. So now just look at this timeline. We have the universe existing simultaneously with God because we are forced to, by the bounds of logic, to not allow anything to the left of the existence of the universe, since that is when time starts existing and nothing can exist before time starts existing because there is no before at that time. So now if I look at this timeline and argue that this leftmost point here where the universe starts to exist cannot possibly have happened without a cause, then do you see another timeline that starts at the exact same position that I can also make the same argument for? That's right. It's God's timeline. I can look at God's timeline that begins at the exact same moment and argue this leftmost point here where God starts to exist cannot possibly happen without a cause, because the same argument applies to both timelines. You cannot make the case for the universe's timeline but then pretend that it doesn't apply to God's timeline because it's inconvenient. But if you apply the same principle to God's timeline, it shows that even God began to exist. So what's a theist supposed to do in this case? Well, the solution is that you add this extra condition for the definition of begin to exist so that it ends up excluding God from the definition. And that's why Craig was forced to add that the thing that begins to exist cannot have ever existed timelessly, because Craig also claims that God exists timelessly without creation. But as I've already pointed out earlier, things existing timelessly is a meaningless notion. Craig doesn't define that term, and the only examples he comes up with are abstract ideas and imaginary entities like bodiless minds. On his website, in his article titled God and the Beginning of Time, he describes this timeless existence of God as follows. He says, if God is changeless prior to creation, perhaps the time which characterized such an existence was radically different from metric time. In a metrically amorphous time, there is no difference between a minute, an hour, or an eon. More exactly, such measured intervals of time do not exist at all. So by metric time, Craig means the normal time we are used to. So he's saying that in this timeless existence, there is no difference between a minute, hour, or an eon, since no such intervals of time even exist. So think about this for a minute. How absurd is it to call such a notion time? If there are no temporal intervals, then in what sense is this supposed to be time? What is time if not the intervals that make up time? Why make up this abstract notion that has nothing to do with time, but still call it metrically amorphous time? That's like me saying I can control time with my bare hands. And when you ask me what I mean by that, I say that I'm referring to electrically vehicular time. That is, my car. I can control my car with my hands, which I refer to as the special form of time called electrically vehicular time. Now, obviously, I would be laughed out of the room for coming up with such a silly definition of time, because just calling something time doesn't make it time. Craig does that same thing with this term timelessly, where he refers to a quote-unquote metrically amorphous time, which has no time-like intervals, no minutes, hours, days, nothing. But he still calls it time. Why? Because he needs a timeless state for his proof of God to work. Basically, he needs a way to excuse God from his own argument. So he's forced to insert this meaningless notion of a metrically amorphous time. And thus his argument goes, well, everything that begins to exist needs a cause, except for things that also exist in this amorphous time, a time which has no hours, days, minutes, or any other time-like property, but it's still time though. And would you look at that? God exists in this amorphous time. So guess we cannot apply this rule to God then. Okay, that's very cute, but it's obviously special pleading. And as if that wasn't bad enough, this then leads to other contradictions that Craig does not address. Because what he asserts about God being timeless stands in contrast to a God who acts in time. For example, God cannot have caused Jesus to be born to Mary at a particular point in time in history if he's entirely a timeless being. To resolve this issue, Craig says that God exists timelessly without creation, but exists in time with creation. So my question is God without creation or with creation? He cannot be both at the same time, since that's a logical contradiction. So which is it? Either option you pick will force the negation of all the properties of the other, so God can either be timeless or he can be acting in time, but not both. So adding this property of timelessness to exclude God from requiring a cause doesn't really help Craig's case. It essentially introduces an incoherent term which muddies the argument, making its first premise entirely unintuitive. And whatever sense we can make of that term leads to other contradictions about God anyway. This honestly is a painfully weak case of special pleading by Craig. It's as absurd as saying everything that exists has a cause for its existence, except for things whose name contain only the following three letters, G, O, and D, and in precisely that order. No one would take such an argument seriously because it's blatant and unjustified special pleading. And that's exactly what Craig is doing with this argument that arbitrarily excludes things that exist quote-unquote timelessly from his definition of begin to exist. As an aside, if anything can possibly exist timelessly, it has to be time itself. Not saying that time does exist timelessly, since the definition of timelessness isn't exactly clear from Craig's writings, but if anything were to exist timelessly, the most obvious candidate for this would be time itself. But then this means that time cannot possibly begin to exist by Craig's own argument, and thus it cannot have been created by God, proving that God could not have created the universe, and thus God doesn't actually exist. Anyway, all this confusion and equivocation is just from one half of the first condition of one part of the definition of a key phrase of the first premise of this proof of God's existence. Seriously, this is just such an ugly and convoluted attempt at a proof of God's existence. But it is passed off as precisely the opposite just because of superficial appearance. Fortunately, the rest of the definition and remaining proof is not as convoluted as this earlier part, so we'll make good progress from here on. Moving on to the second condition. T is either the first time at which x exists, or is separated from any t prime less than t at which x existed by an interval during which x does not exist. This one is reasonable. I don't have any objections here. What it's saying is that if something begins to exist at time t, then it either never existed prior to that time t, or if it did exist, there must be a gap between t and the prior time during which it did not exist. Moving on, third condition, x's existing at t is a tensed fact. Okay, to explain this, I need to explain what a tensed fact is, and for that you need to know the two theories of time, the A theory and the B theory. The A theory is the understanding of time that most people have. It sees time separated into three categories: past, present, and future. There is a now in this theory of time, and that is the present moment, and time flows from the future into the present to the past. So the A theory of time treats now as a special moment in time, the moment in which things are actually taking place, and all other moments are not as important as the present one. This is the typical understanding most people have of time, so it shouldn't seem unusual to you. Now, the B theory of time is also called the tenseless theory of time because it treats all moments of time with the same level of importance. This is the theory of time most physicists prescribe to, because for physical equations, it doesn't matter whether they are making measurements in the present or in the past or will do so in the future. The laws of physics must apply equally regardless of what moment of time we're in. The present moment is not special in any way as far as the laws of physics are concerned, so it is generally understood by B theorists that this notion that we have of the present moment of time being special is just an illusion that our mind conjures. It is not rooted in reality. Now, I'm not going to argue here which theory of time is correct or whether they're both correct or incorrect. Maybe I can go further into this topic in another video, so let me know if you would like me to make a video on this. But for the current topic, the point I want to get across is that there are two theories of time, the A theory and the B theory. The B theory is considered as the tenseless theory of time, and the A theory is the tensed theory. Craig believes that the tensed A theory is the valid interpretation of time, and he requires this interpretation for his proof to succeed. So that's what he's saying with this third condition, that X beginning to exist was an event that happened in the past, which is a categorically distinct moment from the present one in which we exist right now. Craig, in fact, points out that if the B theory of time is valid, then the entire question of how the universe came into being is invalid. He says, from start to finish, the Kalam Cosmological Argument is predicated upon the A theory of time. On a B theory of time, the universe does not in fact come into being or become actual at the Big Bang. It just exists tenselessly as a four-dimensional space-time block that is finitely extended in the earlier than direction. If time is tenseless, then the universe never really comes into being, and therefore the quest for a cause of its coming into being is misconceived. Okay, so Craig accepts that his argument only succeeds if the A theory of time is valid, which hasn't been proven by him or anyone else. Now, I don't have any objection to Craig using the A theory for his definition of begins to exist. I think his proof fails regardless of which theory of time he uses because of other flaws in his argument, which I've explained earlier. So I'm not going to go further into this point, but if you want a deeper dive into A theory versus B theory, let me know and I can get into that in a different video. Okay, so this now concludes the full explanation of the term begin to exist as defined by Craig in his own proof. Now, I would honestly bet that at no point in history has anyone thought of this convoluted mess of a definition when thinking of the term begins to exist. And that's the problem with trying to force your beliefs onto a world that doesn't conform with them. To prove that your beliefs are true, you end up having to twist your definition so severely that even the most basic terms and phrases stop making sense anymore. But at least now we know what Craig means by the first premise of his proof. Now let's take a look at the 3 reasons he gives to justify this premise. The first one is, out of nothing, nothing is produced. Or in Latin, ex nihilo nihil fit. Basically, Craig is arguing here that something cannot come into being from nothing. The crux of his argument can be seen in this line. To suggest that things could just pop into being uncaused out of nothing is to quit doing serious metaphysics and to resort to magic. And then he goes on to give examples of a horse or an Eskimo village as things that cannot possibly pop into existence out of nothing. I hope by now you can see how absurd this argument and these examples are. I have already explained how things coming into existence require a cause if there was a time that that thing did not exist, and then a later time when that thing starts existing. Of course, horses or villages or apples or cars require a cause for their existence, because there was a time when they did not exist. But there was never a time when the universe did not exist, because time itself is part of the universe. So yes, you do need a cause to explain things coming into existence from a state where they did not exist. But if the thing always existed, then there doesn't need to be a cause, because there was never a time when it didn't exist. Craig understands this, as he believes there is no need to invoke a cause for God to come into existence, because God always existed, according to his beliefs anyway. But the same is true for the universe. It has also always existed, so it too doesn't need a cause. His examples of horses and villages are of things that didn't always exist, so they are entirely irrelevant here. So this is his first reason, which is entirely irrelevant to the argument he's making. And as you'll see, his next 2 reasons are just rephrased versions of the same reason. Reason number 2. Why only universes? Here Craig is arguing that if things could pop into existence, then why don't we see examples of such events in our daily lives? He says, if things really could come into being uncaused out of nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything does not come into existence uncaused from nothing. Why do bicycles and Beethoven and root beer not pop into being from nothing? Why is it only universes that can come into being from nothing? So as you can see, he's saying the same thing he said in the first reason. Why don't bicycles and root beers pop into existence? Yeah, because nothing just randomly pops into existence. The universe didn't either. It was always there. Just like Craig believes God didn't pop into existence, he was always there. That's the whole point. The universe did not pop into existence. It was also always there. But Craig would argue back. Sure, the universe didn't pop into existence, but it quote unquote began to exist at the first instance of time. And here by began to exist, he means the same convoluted definition that I've already explained earlier. So if the universe began to exist, how could that have happened without a cause? Why don't bicycles and root beers also similarly begin to exist without any cause? And I would respond, simple. Because there's a very special condition that applies to the beginning of the universe that doesn't apply to any of these other examples. And that condition is the universe begins to exist at t equals 0. That is, at the first instance of time. Nothing else that Craig brings up exists at t equals 0. Bicycles, root beers, horses, villages, cars, none of these existed at t equals 0, so they all require a cause for their existence, since there was a time when they did not exist. But that's not true of the universe, which existed since t equals 0. And there was no time prior to that where it didn't exist. In other words, it has always existed, which is why it doesn't need a cause. Now keep in mind that the universe isn't a single monolithic entity. It's not like we are imposing this exception for things that begin requiring a cause on one specific item out of a collection of millions. The universe is all the matter and energy that exists, including the matter that makes us up. It is literally countless billions and billions of particles and all the energy making up everything that exists. So it's not an arbitrary exception to the rule that I'm proposing here. I'm saying this rule doesn't even apply at t equals 0. So this is why only the universe. Everything else that we know of came into existence at some time after t equals 0. The only thing that we know that was present at t equals 0 is the universe. Hence, the universe doesn't need a cause. Moving on. Reason 3. Experiential confirmation. And for the third time in a row, Craig is giving the same reason to justify premise number 1, saying that it is constantly confirmed in our experience. In fact, this time he hasn't even bothered to disguise this as a different reason. He explicitly quotes the translation of ex nihilo nihil fit here in his justification, so there is no new argument here either. All three reasons are the same point, that things don't simply pop into existence without a cause. And yeah, they don't. The universe surely didn't, so it didn't have a cause. But since that doesn't fit well with Craig, he then has to twist the term begin to exist to mean that it has an earliest moment in time, even though there may never have been a time where it didn't actually exist. But then that just completely undermines the justification of this premise. Sure, things that don't exist require a cause for them to come into existence, but there was never a time when the universe didn't exist. So why does it need a cause? Craig does not provide an answer to this. Of course, this twisted definition of begin to exist also introduces a second issue with his argument, because it then becomes applicable to God as well, not just the universe. And that means that even God would then require a cause for his existence. Now, Craig has to insert an additional condition that says that this rule doesn't apply to things that are timeless. And wouldn't you know it? God just happens to be timeless, so this rule doesn't apply to God. But wait, isn't God always acting in time? Doesn't he answer prayers, perform miracles, talks to prophets, guide people to the truth? These are all events that are occurring in time. Oh right, that's true. But I mean, God is actually timeless without the universe, so the rule still doesn't apply to him. Okay, so is God with the universe or without it? He can't be both at the same time, so which is it? And that's how the entire argument plays out. Every time there's a fundamental flaw pointed out in the logic, Craig introduces some new condition to prevent the argument from applying to God. But that introduces further inconsistencies, and on it goes. In the end, this is just a repackaged version of the contingency argument, and it suffers from the same flaws as that argument. Anyway, I hope this clarifies what this argument is actually saying, and shows why something that appears so clear and convincing at first glance is actually deeply convoluted and flawed when you look carefully into it. To conclude, I would like to present a follow-up to this argument to show how it can be used to prove the non-existence of God. So I will start with the conclusion to the Kalam Cosmological Argument and show how it produces a logical contradiction in the definition of God. So the conclusion of the Kalam Cosmological Argument states, therefore God created the universe. Okay, so let's take this as our premise and see where it leads us. Premise 1. God is the creator of the universe. That's the conclusion of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Premise 2. For something to be created, there has to be a time where it doesn't exist. This one's pretty obvious. If something has always existed, like God, for example, you cannot claim that it was created because there was never a time when it didn't exist. 3. From premise number 2, since there was never any time where time did not exist, time could not have been created. 4. Since time was never created, the universe was never created since time is part of the universe. Conclusion: since the universe was never created, God, the creator of the universe, doesn't exist.